All right, everyone. Hello, welcome to Mao and Marxism Part 1. In this lecture and in this reading, I will be covering five main areas. Mao's thought, Mao's character, Mao's action, Mao's relationship with Moscow, and Mao's legacy. Those five, and probably in this first part we'll only cover the first two, Mao's thought and character. But let me introduce what I'm going to be talking about a little bit first. If I say CCP, I just mean the Chinese Communist Party. And then the Russian leaders that Mao related to were Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. Okay, those are the four main leaders that Mao relates to. Now, a main goal, the main driving question in exploring Mao and Marxism is whether Mao Zedong, actually espouses true Marxism. And it's going to be my contention that he actually does not espouse true Marxism. In fact, Mao essentially just presents Maoism, and this is seen through a number of different venues and ways, and primarily these five ways these ways are how we're going to explore to see if Mao matches up to what typically is thought of as Marxism. And so he doesn't espouse the ideology. He doesn't espouse. He really doesn't get along with any of the main Marxist leaders. And on the whole, he primarily just does his own thing. And so let's dive in. But that's the driving question, right? Is Mao presenting and doing Marxism in China? And obviously a broader undertow to this is the way that you understand Marxism. It's my contention. You look at its practice. You look at how it's applied in the different nations that it enters, and to see whether it's actually true Marxism or not. And in fact, we see the exact reverse. We see that Marxism goes down, if you will. It takes a step down for a number of different ways to think about it. One, it's entering Asia, and just in terms of developmentally, economically speaking, it's entering into more of an agrarian economy at this point. And so Mao is actually trying to make his economy grow, whereas true Marxism actually presents that this is an inevitable process where the most developed European countries, really, and even America is where we would expect it to inevitably happen. That's where the proletariat flips the economy, and it becomes, in the end, a true communist state. And so that's not what we're seeing, and that's not what we see with the trajectory of Marxism around the world. In fact, after the Soviet Union and with the fall of the Soviet Union, it flourishes and continues in China, which is not the most developed nation in the world. And so instead of progressing what they argue and what we would think it progresses through Europe and over into the US, we actually see the exact opposite happening, where Marxism continues on, but it's transmogrified, it's mutated, it changes significantly, and arguably Mao changes it to become his own thing, even though he's obviously bringing in and carrying forth some of the ideas and legacy of Lenin and Stalin. He's really just after his own thing, and that's my contention, at least. So here we go. Mao and Marxism. Mao Zedong, also spelled Mao Zedong, is by far one of the most notable political figures of the 20th century, for worse. The Oxford Companion to Politics of the World, edited by Joel Krager, begins to discuss Mao Zedong in the following way. By all reasonable standards of historical judgment, Mao Zedong must be counted among the half-dozen most important political actors in modern world history. Mao was the acknowledged leader of the greatest and most popular of modern revolutions. Maurice Meisner, who wrote the Mao Entry and has written other works on Mao, goes on to say how Mao is unique since he continued to reign for over a quarter century. This sets Mao aside as perhaps a combination of Lenin and Stalin, both founder and sustainer or ruler. According to Chang and Halliday's Mao the Unknown Story, Mao not only becomes a communist in 1920 during the reign of Lenin, but continues to reign as China's leader till the time of his death during the Soviet Union's leadership of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. Now, just one moment, I forgot. I want to show you, this is a lot of my quotes and a lot of my research honestly come from this honker of a book, Mao the Unknown Story. If you haven't seen it or read it, go read it. It's also available on audiobook. But this is Chang and Halliday. If I'm referencing Chang and Halliday throughout, that's it. But there's plenty of other works that you can reference with Mao. This is his little red book as well. You can go read it. It's sort of it's just a Communist Manifesto version for China, but it's all about Mao, essentially. All right. Mao's presence in the world as one of the primary victorious communist leaders outside Russia gives him a significant role, especially given the fact that China has not collapsed as the former Soviet Union did in 1991. So this is this is a big deal, right? China still is going today as a Chinese communist state. It's a single-party state. It is communist, and so by exploring its relationship, or its Mao's relationship to Marxism, we'll get an understanding as to what exactly is going on there. How should we think about even communism or China today? Primarily though, we're only looking at Mao throughout these two videos. The question becomes then whether or not Mao is a Marxist, and to what extent does Mao carry the Marxist baton forward. Lenin was a Marxist and is still revered as the founder of the Soviet Union. But was Mao a Marxist? Furthermore, did Mao espouse Marxist-Leninist thought and practice? Did Mao obey the party line from Moscow? What was Mao's relationship with Stalin? Did Mao work well with Khrushchev or Brezhnev? What do we do with the rise of Maoism? Is Maoism Marxism? That's the central question here. I will argue Mao and his brand of Marxism is just that, his own revised brand of communism that he calls Maoism narcissistically. So really, in the end, it's not Marxism, is what I'm going to be arguing. As we explore Mao and dive into these questions, it will become increasingly clear that Mao did what Mao wanted to do. Chang and Halliday argue thoroughly in their biography on Mao. Mao died with one thought in his head. Quote, Mao's mind remained lucid to the very end, and in it stirred just one thought, himself and his power. Though this could come across as an ad hominem argument against Mao's thought and rule, it should minimally be clear that Mao has Maoism in mind and not Marxism. Simply given his self-propagation of Maoism in the face of the historic Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the other international communist rulers, Mao is only accepting of the Marxist-Leninist party line insofar as it enables his own rule. The evidence necessarily reveals arguments that have come, or that have their own self-ad hominem nature. Thus, this essay will become a depiction of Mao's thought, character, action, with that, his relationship with the Moscow leaders, and then finally his legacy. Mao's self-propulsion through his own Maoism reveals that he is not a true Marxist. Now for the first section, Mao's Marxism and thought. Mao did first become a Marxist in 1920 based on a letter to some friends, but he immediately wavered in his beliefs. Even with his Marxist beginning, we immediately see that Mao wavered intellectually concerning Marxism and communism. Cheng and Halliday noted that when the CCP was founded in China in 1920, Mao, who was present at some of the beginning meetings, had never said he was a believer in Marx or Marxism. Only after he was in charge of a bookstore for communist propaganda, Mao formally mentioned in a letter to some friends that he was a believer in communist beliefs. Cheng and Halliday write, approaching 27, Mao had become a communist, not after an idealistic journey or driven to passionate belief, but by being at the right place at the right time and being given a job that was highly congenial to him. This marks the official beginning of Mao's journey as a Marxist and CCP member. Now note the timeline here, 1920, Lenin is still alive, but Bolshevism and the Bolshevik Revolution is still going on at this point. In fact, there's increasing measures all throughout Russia at this point, the Soviet Union, for implementing Leninist thought and practice, Marxist thought and practice. However, this did not last for long. After 4 years with the CCP, he was fired from his position in the party, was not invited to attend for the next CCP Congress in 1925, and simply returned to his hometown with doing nothing. Cheng and Halliday call this chapter in his life, quote, lukewarm believer, since the party thought his ideology was rather vague. If one traces the rest of Mao's life, one will see that this description more aptly fits Mao's posture toward Marxism and the CCP, since he at other times ignored or ousted, he was at other times ignored or ousted by the CCP. Mao's thought can be seen through what people recorded about him, and here we see that though he may have had Marxist beginnings, he did not remain a true Marxist, especially once he gained power. There are numerous examples that reveal Mao was not interested in calling his own thought Marxism-Leninism, but rather Mao Zedong thought. Notice the difference, right? He's not towing those ideological names. He's towing his own names. Notice the title of the book. As Cheng and Halliday relate, one of Mao's, even his own party members knew this was not Marxism-Leninism. As Cheng and Halliday relate, one of Mao's own old challengers at a CCP meeting said that Mao's thought was the development of Marxism-Leninism in colonial and semi-colonial countries. So notice the reducing or the backward nature of Marxism, not the forward precedent or the developmental nature. It's actually that Maoism took a step down the trajectory, the chain. Mao's response to this synopsis of his enterprise was delight. He was not promoting Marxism-Leninism, he was developing it into something else, his own thought. Another example of confusion concerning Mao's Marxism is found in his book of quotations, which he aptly called the Little Red Book, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, not the Little Marxist-Leninist book. This book was developed in 1960 to educate the army. He considered his quotations to be on the level of Confucius or the Bible, not Marx or Lenin, so really even taking it a step higher, right, to a supernatural level is what he was arguing. But by 1966, everyone had a copy, including a portrait of Mao. This little book eventually became the central task of Chinese Foreign Policy, being published by over 100 countries. By the end of the 1960s, Mao was termed a philosopher. He was not interested in following Moscow. A quick look inside Mao's Little Red Book will alarm the true Marxist reader. Under the section 3 titled Socialism and Communism, one reads the following, and you would want to compare this to my other videos on Intro to Communism, Intro to Socialism, Intro to Marxism to see if it matches up. Quote, taken as a whole, the Chinese revolutionary movement led by the Communist Party embraces the two stages, the democratic and the socialist revolution, which are two essentially different revolutionary processes, and the second process can be carried through only after the first has been completed. The democratic revolution is the necessary preparation for the socialist revolution, and the socialist revolution is the inevitable sequence to the democratic revolution. The ultimate aim for which all communists strive is to bring about a socialist and communist society. Certainly there is Marxist-Leninist language here, but a true Marxist or a student of Marx can see the discrepancy in the order of revolutions. For Marx, the true democracy is the end goal and the socialist revolution is the transition. So socialism comes first, then the democratic revolution or final communist state. For Lenin, these changes are accomplished via the dictatorship of the proletariat, a distinct army of the party, and there is much more precision to these processes. Mao does discuss the role of the people's democratic dictatorship later on, and their role is similar to Russia's Cheka, but the intricate precision by which government is run and founded upon Marx is absent in Mao's thought. Notably, Mao's whole book is a book of quotations about communism from his collective works. There are numerous examples in Mao's work of how there are Chinese revisionists who change Marxism, but one could say that Mao is doing the same thing here. The fundamental reactions of Marxism are there, like rooting out the bourgeois and raising the proletariat, but the processes by which Mao goes about implementing these social changes do not reflect well on Marxist thought or Lenin's thought. Overall, Mao does not seek to help Marxism front and center, does not seek to keep Marxism front and center, as Lenin does when he quotes long quotes of Marx to justify his position. Right? So that's a big difference between Lenin and Mao, is that Lenin actually claims to be the only true Marxist believer, and Bolsheviks really are the true communists. And to support that, Lenin quotes at length. You look through all of his works, quotes at length Marx and Marx and Engels throughout. Whereas you do not see that happening with Mao. Mao is well known for pithy little statements like the following quote from the Little Red Book. Apart from their other characteristics, the outstanding thing about China's 600 million people is that they are poor and blank. This may seem a bad thing, but in reality it's a good thing. Poverty gives rise to the desire for change, the desire for action, the desire for revolution. On a blank sheet of paper, free from any mark, the freshest and most beautiful characters can be written. The freshest and most beautiful pictures can be painted. End quote. This is a different view of the perfect state of mankind described at the end of Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Engels says at the end of his short essay, man at last, the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master, free. This is almost, end quote, this is almost the exact opposite of what Mao is saying. Mao indicates mastery over individuals, not man's self-mastery. It seems Mao is saying that the Chinese people are waiting to express the most beautiful characters and pictures of someone who will paint on them. perhaps pictures of nature. For Marx and Engels, man will become lord over nature and themselves, not being trampled upon. The perspective of the people and their potential is very different between Marx and Engels versus Mao. Even if Mao is desiring some of the same goals of Marxism and Leninism, his methods and ideas are quite different. In the end, his view of preparing for the future is absent. Quote, Mao was not interested in posterity. Back in 1918, he had written, quote, some say one has a responsibility for history. I don't believe it. People like me are not building achievements to leave for future generations. This, end quote, this ahistorical view is only one of the many examples that show how Mao thought of the present, and himself, and not the theoretical, historic cause of Marxism. In the end, Mao's constant endeavor to promote his own thought and not historic Marxism or dialectical materialism begins to bring us to the fact that Mao's thought was not purely Marxist. Now let's turn to Mao's character to see if it is in fact Marxist. So the second part, Mao's character and Marxism. Mao's character is best seen through his personal likes and how he rules, and here we see that Mao's character is not Marxist. In Chang and Halliday's book, there's a chapter entitled Totalitarian State, Extravagant Lifestyle. In Chang and Halliday's book, this chapter reveals repeatedly what the authors have been revealing throughout the entire book, that Mao was narcissistic, privately extravagant, and indifferent to Marxist policies in his own life. Mao did not embody Marxist thought as Lenin had. Instead, Mao always had his own women, cooks, servants, villas, pools, guards, private stashes, and rules, not to mention cash. After Mao came to power in 1949, he began to indulge heavily in these different practices. Chang and Halliday relate, quote, it was perhaps not unreasonable for a leader to enjoy villas and other luxuries, but Mao was gratifying himself while he was executing others for taking a fraction of what he was burning up, and doing so while preaching and imposing abstinence and having himself portrayed as serving the people. Mao's double standard had a comprehensive cynicism that put him in a league of his own. In 1953, the army rounded up women for Mao, even though Mao had been married 4 times and was still married to his latest wife. Quote, apart from singers and dancers, nurses and maids, these all were handpicked for Mao's villas to provide a pool of women from which he could choose whoever he wanted to have sex with. Mao had over 50 villas across the country, and he would not travel to a location unless there was a private villa for him. They were always single-story, sometimes with 50-foot high ceilings, and bomb-proof. His cooks were the best cooks in the nation. His rice was hand-husked. Each kernel hand-husked in order to keep an inner membrane attached for better taste. Food was shipped in from all over the country. His clothes and shoes were not extravagant, but carefully preserved and patched by shipping them off to the best tailors in Shanghai. He did not like new clothes as they were less comfortable. He loved to swim, so at a time when pools were rare in the very poor country, Mao made sure to have pools. They were heated whenever possible with scarce fuel and kept hidden behind the famous signs that read, "Serve the people." Finally, Mao forced the market to only sell his books, from which he collected his own royalties privately. This, among other things, made Mao the only millionaire created in Mao's China. This sort of behavior is not Marxist. It definitely does not match the anti-bourgeois statement or sentiment that he argued for. All was concealed behind serve the people. While even in Russia, the communists would sometimes seek self-aggrandizement, Mao surpassed them all. He was not liberating the people. He was enslaving the people and freeing himself. At this point, we see that both Mao's thought and action does not match Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. It is his own revised brand of Marxism, his own selfish brand of communism. In the next section and in the next video, we will see what kind of Marxism and communism Mao is moving toward. Maoism.